if you're willing to sort of suspend disbelief and forget what you know about the world, and it's not a joke, and enter into a kind of a world of irrationality and deceit, it does hang together. It's an answer. I think ridiculing Tea Party shenanigans is a serious error. It should be far more important, I think it is far more important, to understand what lies behind this and to ask ourselves a question. Why are these justly angry people being mobilized by the extreme right and not by forces that did so quite successfully during my childhood, in the days of the formation of the CIO and other constructive activism? Well, just take one illustration of the recent illustration of the operation of what you might call really existing market democracy, which doesn't have much to do with markets or democracy. Obama, his primary constituency is financial institutions. They have gained such dominance in the economy that the share of corporate profits has risen since the 1970s from a few percent to about a third, which is tremendous economic power. They preferred Obama to McCain, and they largely bought the election for him. It's their funding that carried it at the end. And they expected to be rewarded. And that's why you put your man in office. And they were. But a few months ago, responding to the very visible rising anger, Obama began to criticize what he called the greedy bankers and so on, who had been rescued by the public. And he even proposed some measures to constrain some of the things they do. And punishment for this deviation was very swift. The major banks announced at once, very prominently, front-page stories in the New York Times, that if they were going to shift their funding to Republicans if Obama persisted with this offensive rhetoric. Well, he heard the message. Within a few days, he informed the business press that bankers are, as he put it, fine guys. He singled out for special praise the chairs of the two leading beneficiaries of public largesse, J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, his friends, great guys. And he assured the business world that I, like most of the American people, don't begrudge people seek success or wealth. He's referring to the bonuses and the profits that are infuriating the public. He went on to say this is part of the free market system. Not inaccurate the way free market is interpreted in state capitalist doctrine. Well, people see that, not very happy about it. None of this ought to be surprising. There was an incorrigible radical who talked about it a couple of centuries ago. His name was Adam Smith. You've all heard of him. He observed that in 1776, that the principal, he's talking about England, of course, he said the principal architects of power, of policy in England, are the owners of the society. In his day, they were merchants and manufacturers. Today, the multinationals and financial institutions. And the principal architects of policy make sure that policy will attend scrupulously to their interests, however grievous the impact on the people of England, and even more so on the victims of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans abroad. He was speaking primarily of British crimes in India. That was a primary concern of an old-fashioned conservative with moral values. It might take Diogenes to find them today. But he's basically right. That ought to be a truism. It's one of the few principles of political science that's overwhelmingly supported and obvious and denied, of course, like anything simple and revealing. There's a great deal of fevered discussion these days about whether or when the United States is going to lose its dominant position in global affairs to China and India, the rising world powers. And there's a particle of truth to these laments, but not much. A part that's partly based on serious misconceptions about debt and deficits and crucially, the actual state of India and China, which is nothing like the image that's presented. But also, much more seriously, I won't go into that, the discussions are based on a very serious misconception of the nature of power and its exercise. In fact, several misconceptions. One of them is Adam Smith's truism, but there's another one which dominates scholarship and discussion on international affairs. In these areas, it's common to identify the actors in international affairs as states which pursue something called the national interest. That's some mystical notion that's uniform for the CEO of General Electric and the janitor who cleans the floors. And this national interest is totally divorced from the internal structure of power, quite distinct from Adam Smith. Well, Smith actually had a sharper eye, and his radical truism provides a useful corrective to all of this discussion. So bearing it in mind, we can see that there is indeed a global shift of power, though it's not the one that's occupying center stage. It's a further shift, a substantial further shift from the global workforce to transnational capital. It's been sharply escalating during the last couple of decades, so-called neoliberal period, the period here of financialization and deindustrialization. And the cost is pretty substantial. It includes working people in the United States and those suffering much more severely, like, for example, starving peasants in India, where peasant suicides are rising at about the same level as the number of billionaires, and millions of protesting, probably tens of millions of protesting workers in China, where the labor share of national income is declining even more rapidly than it is in most of the world. China is indeed playing a leading role in these global changes. It's become pretty largely an assembly plant for a regional production system. So Japan and Taiwan and other advanced Asian countries export parts and components to China. They provide most of the sophisticated technology, and Chinese labor assembles it and exports it. Give one example. There was a recent study of this by the Sloan Foundation, which took as one of their examples an iPod that costs $160, and they estimated that $4, that's like 2% of the value added, was added in China. It's counted as Chinese exports, but they're not doing much except putting it together. There's a lot of concern, to read all over the place, about the U.S. trade deficit with China, which is growing enormously. But there's less emphasis, and practically none except in the business press, about the fact that the trade deficit with Japan and Taiwan is sharply decreasing. Well, that's part of the same regional production system. And U.S. manufacturers are right in the middle of it. They're following the same course, providing parts and components and technology for China for them to assemble and export, mostly back to the U.S. Well, for what Smith called the principal architects of policy, for the financial institutions, the retail giants, Walmart and so on, the ownership and management of manufacturing industries, and the various sectors closely related to this nexus of power, all of this is just heavenly. But not for American workers. But as Smith pointed out, their fate is not the concern of the principal architects of policy. Well, returning to the charges against the greedy bankers, we should recognize in fairness that they have a valid defense. They have a task. Their task is to maximize profit and market share. In fact, that's their legal obligation. If they don't do it, they'll be replaced by somebody who will. So that's an institutional fact, not because they're bad guys. Also an institutional fact is the inherent market inefficiency that you learn about in your first term of economics, an inefficiency that requires them to ignore what's called systemic risk. That is, the likelihood that the transactions that they enter into will harm the economy and the population generally. You don't take that into account when you make a market transaction.